Hello, everyone. Welcome to eLearnChat, where it is all about learning. My name is Rick Zanotti, and I am joined today by Harold Muliati. Lesley could not make it because we messed up on inviting her today, so hopefully we'll have Lesley Price on in a couple of weeks again, and our apologies to Lesley. We for some odd reason, thought we had invited her, but didn't. We had some scheduling conflicts. She'll be here next week. In studio, we've got Harold Muliati. He's our video producer, but today he's also co-hosting with me. And we've got a great guest today. Her name is Christie Kittle, which I thought was Kitty when I first read it. I go, Christie Kitty, that's a cute name. Christie Kittle. She is with Washington State University, and this will be a fun interview. Here we go. This show is sponsored by Relay Corporation. Visit us at www.relaycasts.net. Thanks. And we are back, and in that center position of power, we've got Christie. How you doing today, Christie?
Wonderful. How are you doing, Rick?
I'm doing great. And before we start, tell us a little bit. I know we accidentally put out that you were in the wrong university. You're with Washington State, and
Yes.
you're a supervisor and senior lead instructional designer at the university. But you've also got a big amount of experience in a whole mess of other things. You've worked corporate. You've worked K-12. You've worked higher ed. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks. So I am a born and bred Texan. So I got both my undergrad and my graduate in the state of Texas. I started off in K-12. I taught middle school math and loved it. I coached, and then enter Canvas LMS and educational technology. And I had the ability to help other teachers learn instructional technology and kind of get used to it and use it with intention, although I'm sure a lot of people will get this. Started as tech help, right? So how do I turn this on? How do I do this? But as I slowly realized, I loved helping others with technology and learning, in particular, other adults. And if you ever have any history as a teacher in K-12, it takes a special person to stay in K-12. And I loved doing that. I did that for about 8 years. But then, sometimes you get that light bulb, that little fire inside you. And I learned about the world of instructional design, which I had no idea existed until about 2013, 14, when I met someone who was an instructional designer. And I was like, wait, that's a thing? I could do that for a living? And that's exactly what I did. I got a master's degree in instructional design and moved to that. And so I dabbled in corporate, both internal training, external training, e-learning, PowerPoint, instructor-led, all the type of modalities. And then right now where I am is higher education. And so I kind of have a lot of experience everywhere. And so now I've landed in Washington. I will tell you, you will ruffle feathers. The Cougs' biggest rival is UW. And so when I saw University of Washington, I was like, uh-oh, we got to make sure that's fixed because people are going to be up in arms.
Yeah, never mess with sports.
And that's me in a very quick 50,000 foot.
That's great.
And
well,
then,
as an instructional designer, you probably hear all the buzzwords all around you. We've got the current one is probably gamification was the current one several years ago, but right now it's microlearning, little itty bitty learning. You hear a lot about that. And there's a lot of buzz and there's a lot of bad implementation of both of those and a lot of misconceptions as to what they actually are. Well, what's your experience been with, for example, microlearning?
Yeah, so having history in both K-12 and higher ed, we love our buzzwords. We love our acronyms. So microlearning, I think, really stems from the just-in-time teaching. I need something and I need something right now. The lower and lower ability to maintain concentration and learn something. So I think microlearning has its place, but I think it's kind of like the ADDIE model, how some people love it, some people hate it. It's really about the implementation of it, its purpose, and really what goals you're trying to achieve with it. For instance, just in higher education, a lot of it was, okay, let's take the pandemic. You are all of a sudden going from teaching in a big classroom, teaching face-to-face and possibly not using a lot of educational technology, and all of a sudden thrown to, you now have absolutely no face-to-face. You're no face-to-face, you're completely online, which whether in higher ed, corporate, I think we all experience this to some extent. I know I have a friend that's in corporate learning, and we talked about what that looks like. Of everything that was face-to-face, we've got to snap and get it online. So microlearning is kind of, you can see that from the student perspective or from like the SME perspective is where I've seen it is we need to be able to prepare the people that are in the back end trying to prepare to teach in a different modality last minute to be able to feel comfortable and successful doing that. So you can call microlearning the little snippets of information to help get them there. But yeah, microlearning, I think comes from that and the overwhelming capacity and cognitive overload of the internet, because there's so much information out there. People are just desperate for getting to the exact thing that they want and not all of the surrounding context.
It's interesting because that's something that has been happening, I'd say, for a good decade or two, where you don't find that many experts anymore, quote unquote. I mean, a real expert, somebody who actually understands. Let's say you're working on an authoring tool, but you really understand the ins and outs of the authoring tool. Or you're working in some sort of process management, but you understand the process from beginning to end. You don't find a lot of that anymore, or at least not as much. Everybody seems a little more compartmentalized, and everybody thinks they're an expert when they know very small amounts of something. And so you have to kind of get over that hurdle of, okay, what are we teaching here? Who are we teaching? And we've met a lot of people, especially some younger ones, not necessarily, but I met some older ones the same way, who say, I'm an expert in Microsoft Word. Great. Then I need you to index this document, create a table of contents. Oh, what's that? You said you were an expert in Microsoft Word, but I don't know that. That's publishing. No, that's also Word. This is the kind of stuff we run into a lot that we see when you're dealing with people who think they know something really well because they wrote a note once. It's the self-aggrandizement of knowledge, I guess. And so micro-learning, I would say, can also breed micro-knowledge. That's another issue. How much do you really know, and what do you do with it?
Yeah, and the expert, that's a really interesting point, because from the experience I have, I was at one company that we are very small, and so I helped with internal, external, from the oil and gas and super techie things that I was obviously not an expert in, helping consult with design there, all the way to being the subject matter expert and content developer and designer for like internal program or project management and leadership training, right? So it also, I think, depends on the role you play and within an organization, because where I am now in higher ed, our experts need to have such depth and such wide knowledge in everything, because we don't have the ability to have an expert in this and an expert in this and an expert in this. Pass that on to educational technology. I've heard higher ed, especially just because I can see that personally, but I've also have a lot of colleagues in corporate that are experiencing the same thing. The pandemic has also introduced the perfect solution. So says the salesperson that emails me once a week, because they have the perfect solution for my needs for the pandemic. And so I've seen some really large corporate institutions, the amount of software programs, not just LMSs, but just software programs for their processes as well, to help accomplish their goals, makes it almost hard to accomplish goals because you're spending so much time trying to learn all of the tools.
Right.
And then some of the things I experience is, well, I now have all of these tools that really compartmentalize and do a good job for this, but are making it difficult to look at the whole picture and how those things tie in together. And so when you get into that situation, especially with right now higher education with the instructors at my university, they can choose a lot of these tools for themselves and their students. And so there's just no possible way that my team that represents, educational technology can become an expert at every single ed tech tool that someone wants to use. Right. It's just not possible. And so, okay, what level of expertise do I need to be able to support that tool? But then, you can't put so much pressure on one magical tool to do all of your needs either. So that brings an interesting point.
Yeah, we call it kind of the Microsoft project conundrum. Do you want to manage the project or manage project?
Right.
And you wind up, when you're doing Microsoft Project or some of the other project management tools, they're heavy. And you have to spend a lot of time managing the tool versus actually managing the real project. And it's like that with a lot of different tools. And right now there's an incredible dependence on Zoom. And Zoom, WebEx, Zoom, and so GoToMeeting, whatever, they're all pretty much the same in varying degrees. Zoom somehow came out ahead this time. WebEx has dropped into the nether reaches. They're gone almost. And Zoom, I think, upped their revenue by, I don't know if it was $7 or $8 billion. That's amazing, all in 1 year. But is that really the best way to teach? To a point. I know people who teach martial arts, and they're teaching on Zoom now, and I went, that's ridiculous. You unfortunately really would have to feel somebody's body, feel their movements. And when you're doing something like that, you go, oh, I'm not even sure that's a good replacement. But that's what's going on right now. And in so many areas, Zoom and now Zoom's become kind of a verb. Are you doing Zoom? Are you Zooming? And so that's how popular it's become. We don't say, are you WebExing? No. Or are you Skyping? Maybe Skype. But it's interesting how technology and our verbiage changes real quickly. And so now people immediately think Zoom is the way you teach. God, I hope not. But I mean, it's one way, but I would hate to see that the only way. I still don't think we learn as fully without the engagement of people around us and the osmosis you get from people and everything else. And just the cultural part of sharing with other people. It's not the same on online. It can get close sometimes, but not the same. Now, at your college, for example, there were no students on campus, right?
Very, very few.
Yeah.
I think there's very few exceptions with specific maybe science labs, but in general.
How many teachers, how many of the professors were adept at online learning in terms of, or hybrid learning, where you've got instructor-led or facilitated and teaching those subjects that way? Or did they have a real quick learning curve they had to get over?
So there was two big humps. The first one came around spring break, March 2020, which was the emergency remote. It was the Band-Aid. Yeah. How am I going to get through the last part of the semester without completely overhauling everything because I don't have time? And we had, we look back and I think it's really silly with all the COVID limitations, but we had like emergency training for, here are the bare bones of your LMS. At the time, everyone was basically using Blackboard. How do I upload a file? How do I put the Zoom link? Yes, we're using Zoom. So very bare bones. And we had quite popular trainings, and we were in person and we're like, okay, let's open this room. And then we had like 60 to 80 people show up. We're like, okay, let's use 3 other rooms. So we had all this overflow. And so that first hump, the need was a little bit different, but a lot of people did not use the LMS as really a student engagement tool, and maybe not even an assignment turn-in type tool. It was more of a repository of information to kind of put things. Then came the second hurdle, which was during the summer to prepare for fall 21. And then it was, okay, now it's not just emergency Band-Aid. It's, I'm going to basically be doing an entire semester online. And that's similar to what some people in corporate were experiencing as well. As we have all of these instructor-led trainings. Now it needs to be what? Web-based training? Do we want to do e-learning, computer-based? And that was the conversation we had. A lot of the conversation was not just about the tech, but it's about what has to be synchronous, what has to be asynchronous. So we talked about the low stakes. I'm going to do everything almost exactly the way I'd normally do it. So I'm just going to do Zoom for 60 minutes or however long the class was, and then have some things turned in online. And then others wanted to take it a step further and say, okay, let's have people do something before they come to class. So let's have some activities in the LMS that they have the ability to interact with each other and me before we get to class. A lot of the questions I received were tech, right? I want to replicate this exactly. How do I do this in Zoom? Breakout rooms, polls, that type of stuff. So it was kind of mass chaos. I think there was a really large percentage of instructors that did not use the web to their advantage when teaching. There was a good chunk that are great at it and already had it. For instance, a lot of the faculty that I work with are for a global campus. So they're already fully online, asynchronous. I feel like the instructors that have had to teach for a fully online course were far better prepared because they had the experience of using the LMS for more than just a repository, engaging, they could do feedback, and they had to actually use the tech. So I feel like those instructors were far better prepared. But yeah, so there was a little bit of chaos of preparations.
And the students, from what I've heard,
not even talking about students.
Well, yeah, and the students, from what I heard, a lot of them hated it. They hated not being on campus, not being with friends, not hanging out, not learning. And so it was sort of interesting because I know of several, and I know quite a few of the parents too are going, man, my kid hates it. They want to go back to school. So it's sort of interesting because there's a different dynamic.
Well, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, go ahead with your anecdote first. I was going to ask you possibly an involved question, so I'll ask you right after. Okay.
I was going to say my anecdote is kind of twofold. You know, I was watching the students at the university, but I also have a third grader who had to do virtual schooling. So most of the college students, from what I gather, they'd rather be back on campus and in person for the most part, safety aside. But my third grader, on the other hand, did not, because both my husband and I worked full time. So we, it's like in meetings and then trying, if any parents out there will probably be able to empathize how you try to bounce between meetings. And then your third grader is not just frustrated with fractions, but also because there's 5 different logins for all the tools and where this goes, or shout out to the teachers because they did an amazing job. But, there's 3 steps, do this, then do this, do this. My son would do the first one and then he would skip the second and third, but mark it as done. So my son did not want to go back to school because then he would be held accountable for actually doing work.
Interesting.
So I asked him, I was like, why don't you want to go to school? And I was like, you don't want to go to school because you're going to be held, you're going to actually have to do the work. He's like, yeah. Like,
that's
well,
funny.
Yeah. So I'm really glad he's back and did that. But from the student perspective, I've seen a lot of that. And I think it really depends on the instructor and how engaged they are with their students.
So what I was going to ask was, given your experience in many different learning worlds, and I also suspect the answer to this will have changed this in the last couple of years, what are your thoughts on what constitutes effective learner feedback? Because I know that it tends to be a bit different in the education and corporate training worlds, where most of corporate training, it's you get feedback maybe for like an assessment or a test that you take after a course or something. Typically in education, you tend to get it not only for per assignment, but at the end of a semester and so on, and possibly from other learners.
So if you want to talk about accurate feedback, really for me, I like to use the words purposeful and meaningful, and giving direction. So we can get pretty intricate, but really for me, feedback, focusing on formative feedback, is most helpful not for assessing or grading, but really being able to self-assess and tell a learner what they're doing wrong so they can adjust. So we talk a lot about the summative. So a lot of the assessments at the end are, and we can get into the complexities of how accurate that is, and how effective it is. But the summative is, okay, just make sure that you've learned and we can cross you off as certified or correct and move on. But the feedback I'm talking about is before you test, before it's the yes at the end, it's engaging in authentic activities, and the feedback that comes is meaningful and allows a student to have improvement. Because if there's no improvement after the feedback, right, that's the essential piece. That's what makes the feedback purposeful. Think about just a manager, a relationship between a manager and an employee. For my team, if the performance review comes and I tell them you've gotten this, that, and the other wrong, that's kind of pointless to ding them on something at the very end.
Right.
If you haven't talked about it, told them what was wrong, and helped them improve. I see the same thing in learning. For training in corporate, from my experience, that feedback is definitely dependent on how the class is set up. For e-learning, it makes it really easy to give feedback through some interactive activities, and be able to kind of self-assess and see where you're going. I think feedback is underrated and under talked about, really, in terms of how it can help improve learning. And I think it's really hard to give sometimes. From my experience teaching higher education, so I taught for a few years at the College of Education, teaching pre-service teachers how to teach math. And they had to write like a lesson plan for the first time. Whether you're a designer trying to write out planning documents or a teacher doing lesson plans, first time you do it is pretty rough. It takes a lot longer. You question and doubt yourself quite a bit. Like, I know the theory, I know what this looks like. And then writing it out and then actually applying it and realizing that when you go live, essentially, may not actually go as planned from what you wrote down. So taking feedback in that context, that was in depth. The first time I did it, just typing comments in a Word document was one piece, but it's really, really good to be able to see feedback. I say face-to-face. I'll include Zoom or web conferencing or WebExing with that, but to be able to have a conversation about the feedback as well is super helpful. Because if the feedback doesn't allow you to do better, then it's pointless.
Right. And you mentioned authentic activity. What's an example of that?
So we'll take that same example, authentic activity. So I'll start with a non-authentic one. For me, I take it as a teacher because it relates strongly to instructional design as well. You learn about learning theories, right? You've got Vygotsky, and you learn all of these different things. And I think it's really important to understand them. This is a question that I would ask my class is, okay, imagine yourself 5 years down the road, and you're trying to remember certain learning theories for certain things you're teaching. How much do you care about who the learning theory is attached to, like remembering Vygotsky's name, versus the theory itself and how to apply it? What does that mean in context? What does a learning activity look like according to those theories, right? And so for me, a non-authentic would be matching a theory to a person's name, because I have never in my life used that as an instructional designer or a teacher. But what I have used, which is what I would call authentic, is applying different learning theories to different content I was trying to teach or design a learning experience for, based on that theory, right? Based on different theories. So for me, authentic is you are as close as possible to how you would use that in the real world. The real world being, if I'm taking a HR training on ethics, being in a role play or experiencing an actual situation you would experience in your job versus, in a multiple choice test. So for me, world doesn't give me multiple choices very often. So for me, authentic means replicating as close as possible to how you will experience that in that real situation.
Right. Yeah. And of course, building that context that's actually relevant to what the person's going to be doing, what they're being trained for, is going to make things more memorable for them. And I was wondering, do you think, since everything's gone remote, has that, as you mentioned earlier, the one-on-one the capacity to give one-on-one feedback to learners, has that become more or less accessible with everything being, Zoom or other kinds of remote?
This is a great question. I think you're going to get different answers depending on who you ask.
Oh,
For
definitely.
me, specializing in online learning, I would say it's easier. I think what I've heard directly from instructors is for like the fully online course, they feel like they know their students better on an individual level academically because everything's tied to their name in the system, right? I can see Harold, this is how he's interacted with people, and this is what his work is. And I can give direct feedback. We have so many tools that I can give you feedback, like video on something you've done and send it to you. So even though it's not live, I can get pretty in depth with feedback, one directionally at least. I think it's easier. I think a lot, especially some of my team members, I have some team members that are kind of more impulsive in terms, kind of like me. I want to talk about it. So you tell me something like, okay, let's talk. And I'll soundboard and I'll just have that initial reaction. But a lot of students and a lot of my employees in particular, they don't want you to throw it at them. I want you to send it to me. I can process it. Then we can have a conversation. And so the online learning has been able to provide a really good experience for that, giving the feedback, processing it, and then being able to step into a conversation about it. Because, we've already debunked learning styles. That's also a fun one to talk about in education. But certain people process differently and want to have different communication styles. So I think feedback is also not a one size fits all.
Great. And yeah, that was a great answer. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, so we're just about
right there.
at the.
Okay, because before I would jump into feedback, I would also talk about rubrics and making sure that we clearly defined what feedback we're giving and based on what an outcomes alignment. That can be a really in-depth conversation.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, we are just about out of time. That was fast.
Awesome. Thank y'all for having me.
That went really quickly. We'd love to have you again.
Yeah.
It was fun. And we're only just touching on, kind of skimming over the top of some of the subjects. But like we didn't talk too much about managing remotely and all that. That's another area that we like to talk about because it's not as easy managing remotely as people think. And I know
you've through a crisis.
Yeah, I know. You've had to do it. So, we'll invite you back on to talk a little bit more about that and some other topics. So I'm glad you
Wonderful.
could make it. And if you have any questions for Christie, I guess we had nobody in the chat room today, right?
We have people watching, but no
People
one's
watching.
said
Everybody was
anything.
quiet.
Yeah.
Nobody's engaging.
All right.
Well, we had
Thank you.
actually Will Findley said thanks, great discussion. So
Well, thank
thank
you,
you
Will.
for watching, Will.
Thanks, Will. And for all of the people watching the recording, hello.
Yeah. So this is up right now on LinkedIn Live. We will also put the actual recorded show up on LinkedIn, as well as YouTube. It's also been on Facebook Live, and that'll save it out there. And so it'll be out there. You'll be able to see the show again. If you have any questions for Christie, you could either put them on show notes below or reach out to her on LinkedIn.
Yeah, we've got her LinkedIn and her Twitter and her website in the show description on Facebook and YouTube, so you can easily reach out to her there.
That's right. So again, thanks, Christie, for being on the show, and we look forward to
Thanks.
seeing you all next week. Oh, that was my Texan coming out. I'm not even Texan. You all. We look forward to seeing y'all, let's say it right, y'all next week. Have a good one, everyone. Take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.